Thank you, Nicole, for the kind words and helping me get all set up this evening. I hope it goes fairly smoothly. My name is Alan Fiemeyer. I'm the Associate Director of Research at the Schwenkfelder Library and Heritage Center. So our topic tonight is, who are the Schwenkfelder? And I hope I'll be able to answer that question for you. The Schwenkfelders are not as well known as other religious movements that came out of the Reformation movement in the 1500s. You're probably more acquainted with terms like Mennonites or Amish. But the Schwenkfelders come from the same area, the same religious ideas, and have just simply assimilated with the main culture here in Pennsylvania quite a long time ago. So they're not as noticeable. So this is the story of certain early German immigrants to Montgomery County in Pennsylvania. They came early enough that it wasn't Montgomery County yet. It was still Philadelphia County. But we're in the same geographical area. I've broken down the presentation into about 5 different sections. One talks about Caspar Schwenkfeld von Ossig, who was the founder of the Schwenkfelder faith. The Schwenkfelders were sort of spread out during history over certain parts of Europe. First of all, they're found in a portion called Silesia. That really doesn't exist anymore, but we'll talk about that later. There were Schwenkfelders in Saxony. That's a state in Germany in the 1700s. Then the Schwenkfelders came here to Pennsylvania. And last of all, I'd like to introduce you a bit to our library. This is what our exterior front looks like, the Schwenkfelder Library and Heritage Center. We're on Seminary Street. We're a neighbor of the Perkiomen School, if you happen to be acquainted with that prep school, in Pennsburg, Pennsylvania. The building has changed over the years. The effort to form a library and a museum about the Schwenkfelders started as far back as 1884. This first building was built in 1950. In 2000, we added some space. And just a couple years ago, we added even more space. So there have been a lot of changes inside and out. What you see here, what you see here in the front of the building is a new wing that has been put on this front side. The original building is flanked over here, and it's flanked over here. And then this is a new part that we added the last time around. I would just point out that we have 2 floors of archives and storage. There are almost no books lent for public use. It's actually not a lending library, it's a research library. We have an online catalog, and anyone is welcome to come to the library and look at the materials and use the materials. So first we're going to talk about the founder of the Shrenfeldianism, Caspar Schwenkfeld von Ossig. This is a map of Germany This area right here, you can see, is Germany. Just to the east here is Poland. And the section of Poland I'm going to be talking about is just off the edge right here near the German area here, Saxony. So that gives you just a little idea where the Schwenkfelders originated. This is a portrait of Schwenkfeld that was painted in 1556. He was born in 1490 and died in 1561. He was born at the family estate in this Silesian town of Aussich. The area was known as Silesia at that particular time in the 14, 15, 16, and even 1700s. Silesia was a part of Germany. It was a German state to the far east. It butted up against Poland. But now, since World War II, the area called Silesia no longer exists. It's a part of Poland. Now, Schwenkfeld attended the normal schools at that time. He became an advisor to Duke Friedrich II in Liegnitz, Poland. Liegnitz was basically a capital city in Poland, or Silesia. In 1518, Schwenkfeld had a vision, and because of that, he joined Martin Luther's reforms of the state, of the church. Schwenkfeld eventually broke from Luther because he thought Luther did not really change the church enough. Among others, Schwenkfeld wanted a more radical changes. Eventually, Schwenkfeld went into exile in 1529 because of his beliefs. His life was in danger. He spent the rest of his life in Southwest Germany, publishing many books defending his beliefs. He was often in hiding or traveling incognito. He died in Ulm in Germany in 1561. Schwenkfeld's most radical teaching at the time was an interpretation of the Lord's Supper. Schwenkfeld did not believe in the real presence. He did not believe that Christ's actual blood and flesh were in the wine and bread. He believed that communion was a spiritual act. In 1525, Schwenkfeld suggested that no one should take communion until all of the different groups came to a common understanding of the Lord's Supper and how the rite was to be performed. In the early 1900s, the Schwenkfelders collected all of Schwenkfeld's published and unpublished works. They studied, edited, and published all of his works in a definitive edition called the Corpus Shrenfeldianorum. It was issued between 1907 and 1961. You can see the volumes here in the small bookcase. Most of those volumes are 1,000 pages or more. Let's talk a little bit about followers of Schwenkfelders in Silesia. Again, we're going to start by mentioning that Silesia was located on the far eastern border of Germany toward the north, central to north. And at the end of World War II, this part of Germany was given to Poland. And today it's still a part of Poland. The followers of Kaspar Schwenkfeld had lived in Silesia from about 1518 until about 1780. The Schwenkfelders, who eventually came to Pennsylvania, lived in the German state of Saxony between 1725 and 1734. Here you see a slightly different map showing the area of Germany. This particular area here, just to the right of Germany, is Silesia. And just then to the right is the city of Poland. We're going to talk about Saxony. In German, the word is Sachsen. We're going to talk about Saxony because the Schwenkfelders were in Saxony in refuge until they left for Pennsylvania. Caspar Schwenkfeld himself lived in this area of Silesia. He worked mainly for Duke Friedrich in a city called Ossig or Leibnitz, not too far away from here. So the Silesians eventually escaped over the border right here and into Saxony to avoid persecution for their religious beliefs. The village in Silesia where the Schwenkfelders came, who eventually arrived in Pennsylvania, was called Harpersdorf. And that was the hometown of the Schwenkfelders. You see a postcard printed around 1930 depicting a church. Now, the Schwenkfelders did not attend church. They were much like the Mennonites or the Amish. They separated themselves from the main church. This is a Lutheran church. The church was founded as early as 1206, and there was a succession of buildings. The one you see is basically from 1930, but that doesn't look a whole lot different than it did in 1718 or 1725. We'll talk more about those dates later. So this village of Harpersdorf had been the focal point for hundreds of years. Today it is in ruins. It had seating in 3 balconies for about 2,400 people. It was actually a Protestant island in a Catholic area. It was called the Refuge Church. The church was actually in the midst of Catholic territory, but one church was allowed in this area for the worship of Protestants. The Schwenkfelders did not attend this church. The Schwenkfelder marriages were solemnized, and a few Schwenkfelder newborns were baptized there. But the Schwenkfelders did not worship there. The Schwenkfelders worshiped in family groups in their homes. Due to repeated complaints by the Lutheran minister about the Schwenkfelders, the regional Catholic authorities interviewed the Schwenkfelder elders and concluded that the Schwenkfelders had to convert to Catholicism. A delegation of the Schwenkfelders spent 4 years in Vienna, Austria, pleading with the emperor to grant them religious tolerance. Unsuccessful, the delegates returned home and fled with their families over the border into the area of Saxony. So the date 1718 is the year that missionaries arrived in Harpersdorf to convert the Schwenkfelders to Catholicism. It wasn't until 1825 that the Schwenkfelders who came to Pennsylvania left Harpersdorf in large numbers to escape the conversion attempts by the Jesuit priests who had come to the village to convert them. Here is a photo taken in approximately 2014 that shows that church you saw in the postcard in the previous slide. You can see that there's no roof on the building at this time. And while you may suspect that was due to the fighting in the area during World War II, it actually isn't. Most of the roof, virtually all of the roof, survived the fighting in the war. This damage came after the war. This view is out the window. If I can go back for just a second, we're probably looking out of this space right here to take that picture. I did not take this picture. A friend of mine who lives in the village took the picture. So you see everything is actually, there's nothing left of the interior, absolutely nothing. What you see on the ground here is weeds and trees and other things growing in that area. There are some pictures taken by Schwenkfelders who visited the village in 1910. And I can give you a couple of views. What you see here is basically the whole interior end of the church. You have pews on the floor in front here. You have pews in this balcony. You have pews in this balcony, and then the organ is by itself up at the top of the church. But all of these balconies ran all through all four levels, or I should say 3 levels for pews. This is a totally different church. It's one of the so-called peace churches, and it's in the city of Jawor, Poland. And this picture was taken in 2019. But what I want you to see here, this is not the Harpersdorf church by any means. This is a church as it stands today. But what I want you to notice is all the paintings that you see, especially in the ceiling and along the walls, in these corners and so on. If we jump back, then you can sort of see the painting here in the ceilings, and you get a little bit on the walls. You can sort of see them here, and so on. So this is what the Harpersdorf church would look like, more or less. Let's talk about the Schwenkfelders in Saxony now. As I've said before, Silesia was located on the far eastern border of Germany. At the end of World War II, this part of Germany was given to Poland, and today it is still a part of Poland. The followers of Caspar Schwenkfeld had lived in Silesia from about 1518 until 1780. The Schwenkfelders, who eventually came to Pennsylvania, lived in the German state of Saxony between 1725 and 1734. And I do believe we talked about these maps before. This is the state of Saxony. The Germans lived in this, the Silesians who came to Pennsylvania lived in this part of Saxony. And this is where they came from. The city of Osik is in this area. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Schwenkfelders in Saxony. They were there between 1726 and 1734. And the photo you see in this slide was taken in 1934. A large group of Schwenkfelders visited that village that was called Berthelsdorf in 1934. Couple interesting things about this house, which we know from deeds belonged to a Schwenkfelder family. Probably was actually more than one family who lived in this house. One thing I would like to point out is this roof right here is really fairly short compared to this roof on this side, which runs all the way almost to the ground. You find that quite often in Silesia, this particular architecture. These columns here are typically found in houses that were used for weaving. So this family probably had several different looms that they were working in this house at that time. Here you have, of course, the front entrance to the house. The Schwenkfelders actually moved temporarily to the village of Herrenhut, where housing was already available for them. In the following year, they moved about a mile away to the village of Berthelsdorf, where they were permitted to build homes. Here we have a photo that was taken, I think, in 2019. This is one of those old Schwenkfelder houses from the 1720s and early 30s in Berthelsdorf. You can see the very short roof compared to the long roof that reaches quite far down compared to the front roof. And then we have sort of a stone wall here in the front again. So this long roof was probably built that way for protection from the weather. And this shorter side allowed a lot of sunshine to come in and warm the building. The German emperor put a lot of political pressure on the king of Saxony to force the Schwenkfelders out of the king's territory. They were unsuccessful. That is, the Schwenkfelders were unsuccessful in finding any refuge in German lands or in Holland, where they had a high amount of correspondence, writing to find a place where they could stay. They were a rather large group, so that made it a little difficult. So finally, the Schwenkfelders decided to go to Pennsylvania as a place known for religious tolerance. Here you see a painting by a man of the name Panache. He did a lot of painting of Schwenkfelder scenes, like the one you see here. This one is called The Flight from Saxony. So while they stayed in Saxony and built homes there and had businesses there, they were forced out and had to leave after about 8 years living there. Here's a hand-drawn map, which gives you a little better perspective of the distances that they were taking. Here we are, Silesia. This is Poland and Silesia. The Schwenkfelders had moved out of Silesia and were already in Saxony. You see, this is a part of the state of Saxony. And so at this time, they decided to move to Pennsylvania. So they started here. They went up to this point. They then took a river and went all the way down up through here, like this. Then they took a boat from here, not a large ship, not an ocean-going ship, but just a boat, a little bigger than a river-type boat, and came down here into Holland. And then you can see the dotted line goes through Dover and Calais, and then the English Channel into Plymouth. And from there, they go on to Pennsylvania. So that's the route that the Schwenkfelders took when they left Saxony and went to Pennsylvania. The major group of Schwenkfelders to come to Pennsylvania left Saxony on April the 20th and landed in Philadelphia on September the 12th, 1734. In other words, they're overland, walking, going by riverboat, going by a light ship, going by an ocean voyager, took about 145 days. They had to stop in Plymouth, England, but actually they already embarked on an English ship in Holland, because in order to go to an English colony, Britain would approve only of English boats going into an English colony. This is a model of the boat that they took. It's not a huge boat. There were probably close to maybe 180 people on this boat, including the crew. The boat was named the St. Andrew, and we don't know exactly what the boat looked like that they were on, but from old plans of such boats in England, this particular model was imitated. So the St. Andrew embarked on June the 21st and from Holland, and on September the 12th, this main group of Schwenkfelders included 171 men, women, and children, and they were on the water basically from Holland to Philadelphia for 92 days. Let's move on to the Schwenkfelders in Pennsylvania. Again, we have a painting by Panache. He did this one in 1934. It depicts the landing of the Schwenkfelders in Philadelphia. They arrived on September the 22nd, 1734. There were actually a total of 6 different voyages that the Schwenkfelders took between Saxony and Philadelphia between 1731 and 1737. Altogether, all 6 voyages, 204 men, women, and children came. Okay. We have some photos of immigrant homes. These were probably not built in the 1734-35, but maybe just a little later. The Schwenkfelders wanted to settle in all together in one location, but there were just too many of them. They could not find a sufficient amount of land. They actually ended up purchasing land from people who had already settled, built, and were ready to move on. So this particular house you see is about 1.5 stories high. So you have this one story. You can see the beams for the ceiling here, or the floor of the next story, which is a half story, not a full story. These logs were cut squared on the inside and outside, and yet rounded on top and bottom. There's just a wooden shingle roof. They had a so-called Dutch door, and that is divided into 2 parts, a lower part and an upper part. Most of the Schwenkfelders had that particular type of door, I mean. And then you have here a window without any glass in it at the moment. I think it did have at one time some glass, but that has disappeared in the meantime. There are just 2 rooms on the ground floor, and the ceiling was an open beam type of ceiling. This photograph was probably taken around 1900. There was a photographer in the area here near Pennsburg by the name of Fagley, and he took several hundred photos of what life was like for the Schwenkfelders here in Upper Montgomery County. Here's another house built by Schwenkfelders, probably in the late 1730s or the early 1740s. This house you can see is a full 2-story house. Family by the name of Jekyll lived in this house. Again, you can see that the outside and inside of the beams, the logs are squared by axe, and then the tops and the bottoms are round, and they use some sort of material to stuff the cracks. This has an upper area for sleeping. Usually the children slept up in the upper levels. You can see that this has windows, casement type windows. The roof was shingle, wooden shingle. You see a central chimney here for the hearth. And I'm sure that this porch we see here was added on much later. So those are the types of homes that the immigrant Schwenkfelders had in the 1730s and early 1740s. When we look at the heritage, or I should say the legacy of our immigrants, we find that they had a huge collection of hymns, but we have no indication whatsoever that any of these people knew anything about music. They obviously sang their hymns. They had memorized the music. They evidently did not use that many different tunes, but all their hymns were basically sung to just a few different tunes. We know that they used a foresinger, a person who would get the singing going, would set the pitch and get the singing going, and everyone would sing along in unison, not in parts. And since we do not have any musical notation whatsoever from the Schwenkfelders, we really think that the Schwenkfelders themselves did not read music, nor did they know how to write music. And they had some sort of aversion to musical instruments. That's about all I can say. I'm not sure exactly why. They often had to hide out while they were in Europe because people would attack them. And if they were singing, perhaps they might be heard. But one thing that makes us think that they really don't like to have musical instruments was the fact that they changed the words to the 150th Psalm. Many of you probably know that psalm. It's about praising the Lord, and not only by mouth, but also by musical instruments. And several instruments are mentioned. Well, the Schwenkfelders changed the 150th Psalm. Instead of praising him with trumpets and other types of musical instrument, they replaced the instruments with phrases of joy and spiritual phrases, other spiritual phrases. Around 1850, some boys, Schwenkfelder boys, actually formed a brass band. It was frowned upon by not only the preacher where they lived, but also by their parents. But eventually, when they learned how well the boys played their instruments, they finally approved the band and allowed them to continue to play. As far as we know, the first church instrument in a Schwenkfelder church was installed in 1911. What you see in the picture is a typical Schwenkfelder hymn book. It is full of nothing but the words. along with the first line of the hymns, you have a line here, which is the name of the tunes. So they knew all the tunes by heart and would sing the songs. And sometimes the hymns were not terribly long. This one seems to be about 8 verses long, but they have some that are as long as 20 or more verses. So this gives you some idea of what the hymnals look like in Silesia, in Saxony, and in the early part of Pennsylvania. They brought lots and lots of hymnals with them. They have been using hymnals by other similar church groups going back as far as the 1530s. Here you see the title page of the first hymnal they had printed here in Philadelphia by Sauer in 1762. It's quite a thick book. You can see this is the second edition. That's a little thinner. And the third edition is even thinner. And I believe this is because while they were singing German when they arrived here, as the generations go by, the hymns become old-fashioned, or perhaps not as many people knew German fluently. And by the time you get to this book printed in 1869, there are probably really not that many people speaking German. Perhaps it was the church language, but their everyday language was probably English by then. The Schwenkfelders were very interested in education. And in 1764, they decided to establish their own school system. And this particular document, just the first page of the organization of the church system, you can see that they're starting to use a mix of English and German words in what they write. So we can tell already by 1764 that English is becoming more and more a part of their language and not German. So you see they give this document gewisse. The first word is a German word. The next word is an English word. Then we have a German word. Now we have an English word, and so on. They just sort of mix English and German all together. And that's sort of reflected in the purpose of the school as well. For example, they, in this organization, are teaching elementary school, beginning school. They're teaching boys and girls, not just boys, but boys and girls, reading and writing, both in German and English. Then arithmetic, which was mainly in English, and geography, again, German and English. So we see that the speakers are leaning more and more to English by the 1760s. Here's a document printed in 1851, and you can see the same mix of English and German. So here they've taken the English word constitution, and they're naming this document the Constitution of the Schwenkfelder Community or Society. They're actually called it as society. And so you can see immediately that we have that mixture. The Constitution has a long history. It wasn't printed until 1851 for the first time, but it had started out in the 1760s. Many of the immigrant generation were afraid that people would forget the traditional faith, and so they wanted to preserve the doctrine and the discipline of the community by eventually writing everything down. So the first time the Schwenkfelder Society was formed officially and the document was ratified was in 1782, as you can see right here, 1782. So although there had been some changes in the church between 1782, they decided eventually nobody could remember all of the rules and regulations, and so they had them written down and printed in 1851. Actually, the Schwenkfelders did a fair amount of publishing in the early days. The first thing they had published here, they did not publish anything before they came to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia. They printed a broadside, 1742, by Sauer, and these were written mainly by Schwenkfelders. So a man by the name of Abraham Wagner wrote the broadside. Then they printed that hymnal that you just looked at, 1762. That was followed up by a catechism in 1763. So you see, they're doing a lot of things to modernize and update their church materials. In 1771, they actually printed a book back in the old country, back in Harpersdorf, about the life of Schwenkfeld. Then they printed a second edition to the Catechism in 1784, prayer book 1806, a hymnal, the second edition of the hymnal in 1813, reprinted the life of Schwenkfeld in 1830 here in Sumneytown. They published a compendium of their doctrine, which had languished in manuscript since 1767. They printed the Constitution that we just looked at for the Schwenkfelder Society. The first of Schwenkfeld's works to be published in English was in 1858. And after that English translation, then the Schwenkfelders started to reprint more and more of Schwenkfeld's works. For example, there were 5 different treatises printed in one volume in 1859. And from there, it continues on. Let's move on to some comments about immigrant life. And first, clothing. Like many of the Amish and most of the, most of the Amish and many of the Mennonites in the area, clothing is a very important piece of identity. And the German Schwenkfelders were just the same. But their rules were not quite as strict. In fact, they really didn't have printed rules about clothing. This came up in their general conference 3 or 4 different times over the decades. And in each case, the House Fathers just simply decided to leave it up to the individual family about any specific rules. The general rules were that it could not be some clothing style that was in fashion. It had to be a little old-fashioned, but not so old-fashioned that it was easily seen as being old. But it couldn't be too new either, and absolutely forbidden was the creation of any kind of clothing or adornment for the body. The Schwenkfelders did have rules about marriage. In early times, there was an actual contract that was written up between the parties. The minister had to agree to the marriage. The parents of both the bride and the groom had to agree to the marriage. And it had to be announced in the church a couple months before the marriage actually took place. That would allow, of course, any objections to be raised. I'll just talk for a moment about pacifism. The Schwenkfelders were somewhat, not totally pacifistic, but had a variety of experiences. In Europe, sometimes Schwenkfelder men were pushed into service as punishment for being Schwenkfelders. They had to fight on the front lines in those cases. So they were soldiers, but not by volition. In the French and Indian War here in Pennsylvania, they really did not participate, with the exception that they joined in with the Quakers and supported the friendly association that the Quakers had established. In the Revolutionary War, sometimes their property was taken and used by the Continental soldiers. Pulaski and his cavalry was camped in a Schwenkfelder field for several days. The officers occupied the residence of the Schwenkfelder family, and they had to basically move out to another location. Some of the Schwenkfelder families supported the American troops with food and also feed for the horses. A few helped with providing wagons. Later on, after the Revolutionary War, you come into the time of the militia where there was a lot of drills. Men were forced to come out and drill. Schwenkfelders often paid for substitutes to take their place, or they paid the fines that were levied because they did not participate in the drills. In the Civil War, quite a few Germans, Schwenkfelders, took part. I'm not so sure it was all voluntary. I think they were pressed in many different instances. And I just wanted to make one comment about language. And the saying is, and I think it's relatively true, that the first generation of the immigrants to land here usually retain their own native language that they've spoken all along. Maybe the really young, maybe the preteens might learn a little English, but generally speaking, the immigration just simply stayed in German. The Germans sort of isolated themselves. They didn't mix a great deal, primarily because they were not in a city. They were out in farmland and had a lot of contact with one another, but not very much contact at all with other ethnic groups. The second generation then is what we were looking at, where we were getting quite a mix of German and English in the same documents. And one can assume they probably spoke that way as well. It's getting to the point where the only time they speak German is in church. It's the church language. And then the third generation normally speaks mainly English. And and maybe they use some German in the church service. It usually starts by first, there's 1 week, the first weekend of the month is an English service, and the next 3 services are German. And then it moves up to 2 in English and 2 in German. And finally, it becomes all English.
So, Alan,
yes,
we have about 10 minutes left, and we do have some questions in the chat. Would it be okay if we moved on to some of the questions? How much?
Okay, that would be all right with me. I just want to show 1 or 2 pictures more.
Sure.
Okay, let me go right there. I'd like to just say a couple words about our library and museum called the Heritage Center. This is the building in 1950. This is a building expanded in 2000. This is the way the building looks now from the side where the entrance is. This is a part of our book collection. We have other types of shelving for much of our printed material. We have a Conestoga wagon, and one of the Schwenkfelder kids in the early or mid 1800s drew some pictures. This is one of our galleries of furniture. This is a gallery of household implements, and we have a loom in the lower left-hand corner. Here was the businesses that the Schwenkfelders organized in the 1800s. They built threshers. There were 2 families that invented and built threshers and had quite a business. One built these horsepowers, so-called, and and here's our new barn. It's not a new barn. It was actually first built in 1826, but it's new to the collection. It was actually a donation to the collection. Some inside shots of the barn. And apple juice was a very common beverage at that particular time. Okay, I'm ready for questions.
All right, awesome. Well, I want to thank you so far for that presentation. If you can end your screen share, and then maybe we can bring you back up. We would love to have you back if you don't mind, because we see that we did skip a lot of your presentation. There was so much information in it. But let's start off with the first question I see is, what did the columns on the home have to do with weaving?
Would you repeat the question, please?
What did the columns on the home have to do with weaving?
Oh, the usual story that I've heard is that with a number of looms in the area, and some of these are very large looms, they had to have extra support for the ceiling and the room that all the looms were in.
The next question was, what was their reception like in Pennsylvania? Can't imagine the challenges of the group arriving looking for housing in the area.
We know very little about their initial contacts. A couple of Schwenkfelders had already come to America as very small groups, one group of 1 and another group of 5. And so they had evidently prepared for this large group to come in 1734. They may have had time to organize some housing for some of these people. Some of them moved on from Philadelphia quite quickly. Others stayed back for a little while. But we really don't have much information at all about how they were received. Next.
All right. So, and this is kind of like a combination of a couple of the different questions. It's what doctrine did the Schwenkfeld teach? How he thought Luther didn't go far enough, he said. What did he advocate for? And then also someone asked, what were their beliefs? And in what ways did they disagree with Martin Luther?
Okay, so one way that the radical reformers differed from Martin Luther and others who were more with Luther was the status of the church and the state. The radicals wanted total separation of faith and state. That is, today, even in Germany, most of the churches are state churches. That is, they may be a Lutheran church, but they're really under the state of Germany. And that the radicals always fought against. They wanted total religious freedom. I mentioned the difference in communion or the Lord's Supper. The Schwenkfelders saw that more as a spiritual event that evolved within the person through the Holy Spirit. The Schwenkfelders did not take communion. They did not believe that the bread and the wine, the physical elements, were of any real value for salvation. I think that's about all I want to do right now.
All right. Well, I think that was good. So someone else wants to know, does the name Schrenksville have anything to do with Schrenfelder? I'll pronounce it. Schrenfelder, yeah.
Does Schwenkfeld, well, I didn't quite understand the question.
So there's the Schrenksville, I'm assuming the town Schrenksville. Does that have any relation to it?
No, there's no relation with the town of Schwenkfeld.
Okay. Why did they choose to come to Pennsylvania specifically? You kind of touched upon it, but there were some people here already, and they prepared for a large, for more people to come over. But why did they choose here?
Well, their main reason for coming here was Pennsylvania was well known in Europe as the place for religious freedom. And since the Schwenkfelders were totally harassed and forced out of any part of Germany, they ended up coming here. I think they had sent a scout, so to speak, who went, one person in 1731, and evidently this person had communicated with them and said, yes, it's true that you do have religious freedom here. And that was their main reason for coming to Pennsylvania.
Okay. And that kind of dovetails into a question I had personally. So I know they obviously settled in this area. Did they spread out throughout Pennsylvania, or did they just mainly stay in this area, Montgomery County?
Well, they gradually spread out. I mean, today, there are probably Schwenkfelder descendants in virtually every state of the United States. And that happened gradually. At the moment, there are only 4 Schwenkfelder churches, and they're all here in this neck of the Montgomery County. We're in the upper Montgomery County. Central Church is the largest, and there's Palm Church is the second largest. I don't know the exact number of membership, but it's probably around 2,300.
All right. Are the Schwenkfelders considered to be a part of the Anabaptist movement?
No, not really. The Anabaptists were a little more, what should I say, focused on baptism, rebaptism. The Schwenkfelders, again, believe that the Holy Spirit is a part of the worship service, that they didn't really believe in baptism, although Schwenkfeld himself did not, did not forbid baptism like he did communion. But I'm afraid I can't think of anything else at the moment about the baptism.
Okay. So we are at 8 o'clock. We do have another question that is concerning, like, can you talk about the arts that we kind of glazed over and pushed through, but we are out of time. Like I said, I would love to invite you back to talk, if you're willing to talk a little bit more in depth with that portion of your presentation, because I'm interested in as well. But I would like to respect everyone's time, because we are at 8:02 at this moment. So I want to thank you, Alan, and thank you everyone who attended this program tonight. And I realized that I actually forgot to introduce myself. My name is Nicole Husbands. I'm the Young Adult and Outreach Services Librarian at Indian Valley Public Library. I just was really excited, so I just hopped right in. So thank you so much, Alan. Thank you so much for the participants. And I'm going to end this recording, and hopefully we can go into some more depth with some of the other information you would love to share with us in the future. So have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.